Mom, why have you hated my wife since the day we got married? My son asked that question without raising his voice. Yet it shattered something inside me that 40 years of hardship never could. I looked into his eyes, searching for even the smallest hint that he was joking, but all I found was quiet certainty. Then another thought struck me with even greater force. If he truly believed that, who had taught him to see me that way? And how long had they been rewriting my place in my own family while I never noticed? I opened my mouth to answer, but something stopped me. A single sentence formed in my mind, colder than anything I could have spoken aloud. Someone had stolen my son without ever asking him to leave home. I wish I could tell you that I immediately understood what was happening, but the truth is far more unsettling. The worst lies are never shouted. They arrive wrapped in concern, whispered between ordinary conversations, repeated until they sound like memories instead of inventions. Looking back now, I realize that my family did not fall apart in one dramatic moment. It happened quietly, one missing phone call, one canceled dinner, one forgotten invitation at a time. My name never disappeared overnight. It faded slowly until even my own son no longer recognized the woman who had raised him. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I was 69 years old when I finally understood that loneliness inside a family feels different from being alone in an empty house. My late husband, Thomas, used to say that trust was like fine crystal. It could survive decades if handled with care, but one invisible crack could weaken the entire piece. After he passed away 3 years earlier, I held on to those words. I believed Daniel and I would always remain close because we had survived every difficult season together. He had been a gentle little boy who never forgot Mother's Day, who used to leave handwritten notes on the kitchen counter thanking me for making his favorite pancakes before school. Even after he married Vanessa, I told myself that change was natural. Young couples deserved space. They needed time to build traditions of their own. Whenever weeks passed without hearing from him, I found excuses on his behalf before anyone else could. He's busy at work. They're traveling. The kids have soccer practice. Life moves quickly. I repeated those explanations so often that eventually I believed them myself. Yet there were moments that refused to leave my mind. Birthday cards that somehow never reached my grandchildren. Invitations that seemed to vanish. Holidays that became strangely complicated whenever I offered to host. Daniel always sounded apologetic but somehow unavailable. Vanessa always sounded warm. Yet every conversation ended with another reason why getting together simply wasn't possible. At first, each incident felt too small to question. Then they began fitting together like pieces of a picture I refused to see. Even my neighbors noticed I was spending more evenings alone on my front porch, waving at children riding bicycles while wondering why my own grandchildren barely remembered the smell of my homemade apple pie. I never blamed Daniel. A mother's heart protects her child even when her own heart is breaking. What I didn't know was that every mile growing between us had been carefully measured by someone standing much closer than I ever imagined. And on the afternoon my son asked me why I hated his wife, I realized I wasn't listening to his voice anymore. I was hearing someone else's words coming out of his mouth. That conversation stayed with me long after Daniel and Vanessa drove away. Their car disappeared at the end of my quiet suburban street, but the silence they left behind settled into every room of my house. I stood by the living room window until the taillights vanished, still hearing my son's question echoing in my mind. It was not the accusation itself that hurt the most. It was the certainty in his voice. He had not been asking whether it was true. He believed it already. I made myself a cup of tea, the same chamomile blend I had been drinking every evening since Thomas passed away. The kettle whistled softly, filling the kitchen with a familiar sound that once meant comfort. That night it only reminded me how different everything had become. There had been a time when Daniel stopped by every Sunday afternoon. He would walk straight into the kitchen without knocking, steal a cookie from the cooling rack, and tell me about his week before I even had a chance to pour coffee. After he married Vanessa, I expected some changes. Every mother does. A new marriage deserves room to grow. I welcomed Vanessa with genuine warmth. I handed her my grandmother's apple pie recipe, invited her to every holiday dinner, and even offered to watch the children whenever they needed a quiet evening together. She always smiled politely and thanked me. Looking back, I realized her smiles never quite reached her eyes. At first, the changes were almost impossible to notice. Thanksgiving dinner moved to their house because it was supposedly easier for the children. Christmas breakfast became Christmas dinner, then disappeared altogether because they had started visiting Vanessa's parents instead. Birthdays became quick video calls instead of afternoons filled with cake, balloons, and family photographs. Every explanation sounded reasonable by itself. Work deadlines, school activities, soccer tournaments, piano lessons, a child with a cold, heavy traffic. Every excuse seemed believable because life truly does become busy for young families. Whenever friends asked why I spent more holidays alone, I defended Daniel before they could even finish the question. I insisted he was a wonderful son. I said I was proud that he worked so hard to provide for his family. Deep down, I believed every word because believing anything else would have meant accepting that something had changed between us. One Saturday morning, I drove to the neighborhood bakery and bought a dozen cinnamon rolls because Daniel had loved them since he was a little boy. I decided to surprise the family. It was only a 25-minute drive to their house. As I turned onto their street, I noticed balloons tied to the mailbox and several cars parked in the driveway. Children's laughter drifted across the yard. My heart lifted. Someone was having a birthday party. I carried the warm box of pastries to the front porch, smiling as I imagined my grandchildren running into my arms. Before I could ring the doorbell, the front curtain moved slightly. I saw Vanessa looking directly at me. For just a second, our eyes met. Then the curtain closed. No one answered the door. I waited nearly 5 minutes before returning to my car, telling myself they probably had not heard the bell over the noise inside. As I drove home, I kept repeating the same comforting thought. It was only bad timing. It had to be. I did not yet understand that the distance growing between my son and me was no accident. It was being carefully shaped, one quiet moment at a time, by someone who wanted me to believe I no longer belonged. The following Monday morning, I decided to stop guessing and start paying attention. Not because I suspected anyone of lying, but because my heart refused to ignore the growing pattern any longer. I pulled a small notebook from the kitchen drawer, one Thomas had once used to keep track of home improvement projects, and I began writing down every conversation I had with Daniel and Vanessa. The exercise felt almost foolish at first. Surely I was imagining things. Surely there was a simple explanation that would eventually make sense. Yet as the days passed, little details began lining up in ways that left me unsettled. Whenever I called Daniel's cell phone, it almost always went to voicemail. A few hours later, Vanessa would return my call instead, explaining that he was in a meeting, driving, helping the children with homework, or simply too exhausted to talk. She always sounded pleasant, never rude, and she always promised that Daniel would call me back soon. Most of the time he never did. Then something else caught my attention. Whenever Daniel finally spoke with me, he often seemed surprised by things I supposedly already knew. One afternoon he casually mentioned how sorry he was that I could not attend Lily's school music recital the week before. I paused, confused. I had never heard about any recital. Before I could ask another question, he quickly changed the subject to work and ended the call. A few days later, I mailed birthday cards to both grandchildren with handwritten notes tucked inside. 2 weeks passed without hearing a single word. Finally, I asked Daniel whether the children liked the cards. There was a long silence before he quietly replied, "Vanessa told me you decided not to send anything this year." My hands froze around the coffee mug I was holding. I told him I had mailed both cards on time with bookstore gift certificates inside. He sounded genuinely puzzled for a brief moment, then softly said that perhaps the mail had lost them. I agreed because I did not want to argue, but something inside me whispered that too many unlikely accidents were happening to one family. The following Friday, my neighbor Grace Collins stopped by with a basket of fresh tomatoes from her garden. Grace had lived across the street for nearly 20 years, and after Thomas passed away she often checked on me without making it feel like charity. We sat on the back patio watching squirrels chase each other across the fence while sipping iced tea. Eventually she looked at me with unusual hesitation. "Eleanor," she asked carefully, "may I ask you something without offending you?" I smiled and assured her she could. She lowered her voice before continuing. "Did you really tell Vanessa that you preferred spending time with your friends because your grandchildren were too noisy?" The question caught me completely off guard. I stared at her, unable to answer for several seconds. Finally I shook my head. I have never said anything remotely like that. Grace looked relieved and troubled at the same time. She explained that several weeks earlier she had bumped into Vanessa at the grocery store. During their conversation, Vanessa casually mentioned that I had become distant from the children because I found them exhausting and difficult to be around. Grace admitted she had not believed it then, but after seeing how little I spoke about my family lately, she had started wondering if something painful had happened. I felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. For the first time, someone outside my family had unknowingly revealed that words were being placed in my mouth, words I had never spoken. And if Grace had heard that story, how many other people had heard different versions of me that never truly existed? For the next several days I resisted the temptation to confront anyone. Every instinct told me to call Daniel and demand an explanation, but another part of me knew that emotions without proof would only push him farther away. If someone had spent months quietly shaping his opinion of me, then one emotional conversation would not erase years of carefully planted doubt. Instead, I continued living my ordinary routine while paying closer attention than I ever had before. Every Tuesday morning I volunteered at the local library for a few hours, helping organize donated books. It was peaceful work that usually cleared my mind. That week, however, I found myself replaying every family gathering from the past 2 years. I remembered small moments that had seemed harmless at the time. Vanessa insisting she would pass along my messages because Daniel was overwhelmed at work. Vanessa offering to coordinate holiday plans so no one would feel stressed. Vanessa smiling warmly, while gently taking control of every conversation involving the family. None of those moments looked suspicious by themselves. Together, they formed a pattern that I could no longer ignore. 2 days later, Grace called and asked whether she could stop by after lunch. The moment she stepped inside my kitchen, I noticed she seemed unusually serious. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug before speaking. "I almost did not tell you this," she admitted. "But I think you deserve to know." She explained that earlier that morning, she had visited the shopping center across town. While waiting in line at a neighborhood cafe, she accidentally recognized Vanessa's voice from the next table. Vanessa was meeting another woman, someone Grace did not know. They were speaking casually, never realizing anyone nearby might recognize them. Grace had not intended to listen, but one sentence immediately caught her attention. She lowered her voice as she repeated the words to me exactly as she remembered them. "He believes me every single time. As long as he thinks his mother is judging our marriage, he never questions anything I tell him." My stomach tightened. Grace continued carefully, afraid of hurting me further. She said the other woman laughed quietly before asking whether Daniel had ever tried talking directly with me. Vanessa simply shrugged and replied, "Why would he? I always explain things before he even thinks about calling her." Neither woman sounded angry. According to Grace, the conversation had been almost casual, as though they were discussing grocery lists instead of someone's family. I sat completely still, unable to find words. Until that moment I had only suspected misunderstandings. Now, for the first time I had reason to believe they were being created deliberately. Even then I refused to jump to conclusions. I asked Grace whether she might have misunderstood the conversation. She shook her head without hesitation. "Eleanor," she said softly, "I have known you for 2 decades. I know the difference between confusion and manipulation." After she left, I opened the notebook again and carefully wrote down everything she had shared with me, including the date, the location, and every sentence she could remember. I realized I was no longer searching for reassurance. I was collecting pieces of a puzzle that someone else had scattered on purpose. And for the first time since Daniel had asked me that heartbreaking question, I felt something stronger than sadness beginning to grow inside me. It was quiet determination, because if the truth had been buried beneath months of carefully chosen words, then only patience would uncover it, one undeniable piece at a time. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. Every instinct urged me to defend myself, to send long letters explaining what I had never said, to knock on Daniel's front door until he listened. But every time I imagined that conversation, I reached the same conclusion. If someone had quietly built a false story over months or even years, then one emotional afternoon would only make me appear exactly as that story described. So I chose silence not because I was giving up but because I was finally paying attention. I stopped calling every few days. I stopped sending follow-up messages whenever I received no reply. Instead, I kept careful notes in the small notebook Thomas had once carried in his shirt pocket. Every unanswered voicemail, every birthday card I mailed, every invitation that disappeared without explanation. I even kept the postal receipts whenever I sent something to the grandchildren. It felt strange at first, almost as though I were documenting my own life for a stranger. Yet each page brought an unexpected sense of clarity. Facts do not become less true simply because someone refuses to acknowledge them. About 2 weeks later, I received a cheerful text message from Vanessa asking whether I would be interested in attending Lily's spring dance recital the following month. I smiled as I read it. It was the first invitation I had received in a long time. I immediately replied that I would love to be there and asked what time I should arrive. Hours passed with no answer. The next morning she finally responded, apologizing that the auditorium had very limited seating, and that they had already given my ticket to another relative. I thanked her politely and wished Lily good luck. Then I wrote the entire exchange into my notebook. 3 days later Daniel called during his lunch break. In the middle of our conversation he casually said, "Mom, Vanessa was disappointed you turned down Lily's recital. She really wanted you there." My heart skipped for a moment, but I kept my voice calm. Instead of arguing, I simply asked, "Daniel, would you like me to forward our text conversation to you?" There was a long pause on the line. He sounded genuinely confused before quietly answering, "No, that is all right. Maybe I misunderstood." We changed the subject, but that brief silence stayed with me long after the call ended. It was the first small crack I had heard in his certainty. A few days later another opportunity arrived unexpectedly. My granddaughter Emma called me from her mother's phone while Vanessa was inside a grocery store. She spoke quickly, her young voice full of excitement. "Grandma, thank you for the art set. I love it." I smiled, although I had never sent her an art set. Before I could ask another question, she continued, "Mom said you picked out the purple one because you forgot my favorite color is blue." Then Vanessa returned to the car, and the call ended almost immediately. I sat in complete silence, replaying every word. Someone was sending gifts in my name while changing the story attached to them. It was such a small detail that many people would have dismissed it, yet it revealed something important. The truth was no longer being hidden only by keeping us apart. It was being replaced piece by piece with carefully crafted versions that sounded believable, because they contained just enough familiarity to feel real. That evening I added another page to my notebook, closed the cover, and realized I was no longer waiting for luck to expose the truth. Whoever had woven this web of quiet deception had grown comfortable, and people who become comfortable eventually stop noticing the loose threads they leave behind. The breakthrough came in a way I never could have planned. I did not discover it because I was clever. I discovered it because the truth has a habit of revealing itself when people become too confident that no one is watching. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice sounded distracted, almost tired. He apologized for keeping the conversation short because he was working from home, while Vanessa took the children to a birthday party. We talked for only a few minutes about ordinary things. The weather, his latest project at work, my vegetable garden. Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked whether I had received the family photograph Vanessa had emailed me the previous weekend. I felt my heart skip. I had received no such email. Instead of reacting emotionally, I answered as calmly as I could. "No, Daniel. I never saw it." He hesitated before saying that was strange because Vanessa had assured him she sent it several days earlier. I simply replied that technology could be unpredictable, and wished him a good afternoon. After we hung up, I did not call anyone back. I only wrote another note in my notebook. Late that evening my computer made its familiar notification sound. A new email had arrived from Daniel himself. The subject line simply read, "Did this come through?" Attached was the family photograph along with a short message that said he was forwarding it because he wanted to make sure I had it. I smiled at the picture of my grandchildren, but something else immediately caught my attention. Beneath Daniel's message was part of an earlier email chain that had been included by mistake. Most of it was ordinary conversation about scheduling and school activities. Then I noticed one sentence from Vanessa written several days before. "I already sent it to your mother, but she has not replied. I guess she is still upset with us." Daniel had answered only a few minutes later. I wish she would tell me what I keep doing wrong. I stared at those words for a long time. Daniel truly believed I had ignored him. He was not angry. He was confused and quietly hurt. That realization broke my heart more than any accusation ever could. I searched my inbox carefully, checking every folder, including junk mail and archived messages. There was nothing. The original email had never reached me. I resisted the urge to jump to conclusions. Instead, I printed the forwarded message, highlighted the timestamps, and placed it inside the notebook. 2 days later, another unexpected piece fell into place. Grace stopped by with homemade blueberry muffins and mentioned that she had seen Daniel at the hardware store that morning. She told me he looked troubled and spent several minutes staring at paint samples without choosing any. Before they parted, he had quietly asked her whether I seemed happy lately. Grace answered honestly that I missed my family but rarely complained. According to her, Daniel looked surprised by that answer, almost relieved. Something inside him was beginning to shift. He had started asking questions instead of accepting easy explanations. For the first time in months, I sensed that doubt had entered the carefully constructed story someone had been telling him. It was only a small crack, almost invisible from the outside. But I knew from everything Thomas had taught me that even the strongest wall begins to weaken with a single fracture. I closed my notebook that night with a quiet sense of hope, because I finally understood that I no longer needed to convince my son of anything. All I had to do was remain patient while the truth found its own voice. The following week brought a change so subtle that most people would have overlooked it. Daniel began calling me directly instead of relying on Vanessa to pass along messages. The conversations were still brief, but they felt different. There were longer pauses, thoughtful questions, and moments when he sounded as though he was comparing what I said with something he had heard before. I never rushed to fill those silences. I answered honestly, spoke kindly, and allowed him to reach his own conclusions. One evening he asked whether I had enjoyed the family barbecue they hosted over Memorial Day weekend. I gently reminded him that I had never been invited. Another pause followed, longer than the first. He quietly replied that he distinctly remembered Vanessa mentioning she had called me twice and that I had declined because I preferred spending the holiday with friends from church. I told him I had attended the church service that morning but spent the afternoon alone in my backyard with a book. I did not accuse anyone of lying. I simply stated the truth and let the silence do the rest. A few days later Daniel called again, this time asking if I still kept handwritten letters. I smiled and told him I had saved nearly everything Thomas had ever written to me, along with birthday cards, holiday notes, and family photographs. He hesitated before asking whether I also kept recent messages. I walked over to the small cabinet beside my desk and looked at the notebook that had slowly become a record of every confusing conversation. Yes, I answered. I have kept those too. He thanked me without explaining why and ended the call. Something was happening on the other side of those conversations, but I chose not to guess. 2 afternoons later Grace telephoned me with unexpected news. She had stopped by Daniel's house to return a casserole dish she had borrowed months earlier. Daniel answered the door alone. While they talked, Vanessa arrived home with the children. Grace noticed that Daniel immediately asked whether she had mailed an invitation to the neighborhood block party, because he had never seen one. Grace smiled and told him she had handed it directly to Vanessa almost 2 weeks earlier, asking her to make sure he received it. According to Grace, Daniel turned toward his wife with a puzzled expression. Vanessa quickly replied that she must have accidentally misplaced it while cleaning the kitchen. Grace said the explanation sounded rehearsed, almost automatic, and Daniel did not argue. He simply nodded, thanked Grace, and quietly carried the casserole dish inside. That small exchange might have meant very little by itself, but for Daniel it became another piece that no longer fit the picture he had trusted. The next Sunday afternoon he appeared at my front door without calling first. For a brief moment I saw the same young man who used to visit after college football games, carrying a paper bag filled with fresh pastries from our favorite bakery. We sat together at my kitchen table just as we had done countless times over the years. He looked around the room before speaking. His eyes settled on the notebook resting beside the fruit bowl. "Mom," he said softly, "would you mind showing me what you have been writing?" I slid the notebook across the table without hesitation. I did not point to any page. I did not tell him what to think. I simply trusted that the truth, written one quiet day at a time, was finally ready to speak for itself. Daniel remained at my kitchen table for nearly 2 hours, turning the pages of the notebook one at a time. He never rushed. Occasionally he would stop, read a text message twice, compare a date with the printed email I had tucked between the pages, and then continue without saying a word. The only sounds in the room were the ticking of the old wall clock and the soft clink of his coffee cup as it cooled beside him. I watched my son carefully, not searching for anger but for understanding. There were moments when he closed his eyes for several seconds, as though replaying conversations he had once accepted without question. Finally he looked up at me. His voice was quiet. "Why did you never show me any of this before?" I smiled sadly because I had asked myself that same question many times. Because if I had brought it to you while you still trusted every explanation you were hearing, you would have believed I was only trying to defend myself. I needed you to become curious before any of these pages could matter. He lowered his eyes again and continued reading. Before leaving that afternoon, Daniel asked whether he could borrow the notebook for one night. I hesitated for only a moment before handing it to him. Trust has to begin somewhere, and despite everything that had happened, he was still my son. The following evening he called and asked if he could stop by again. This time there was something different in his voice. Not certainty, not anger, determination. When he arrived, he carried my notebook along with a small folder of printed papers. He explained that after leaving my house he had gone through old emails, text message backups, and phone records. At first he believed he was simply verifying dates, but as he compared everything side by side, strange inconsistencies kept appearing. Messages that Vanessa claimed she had forwarded were missing. Invitations she insisted she had shared with him had never reached his inbox. Emails she said I ignored had either never been sent to my address or contained details that had been changed before he saw them. None of the discoveries alone proved a grand deception. Together they revealed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Daniel admitted that he had asked Vanessa several simple questions the night before. He had not accused her of anything. He merely asked why certain dates did not match and why different stories existed for the same events. According to him, her answers changed several times during the conversation. At first she blamed forgotten details. Then she blamed technology. Later she insisted everyone was remembering things differently. The explanations became more confusing instead of clearer. "Mom," he said quietly, "I realized something while we were talking. Every time I asked for something specific, the answer became less specific." I nodded but remained silent. He did not need advice. He needed space to finish connecting the pieces himself. Before he left, I walked to the hallway closet and removed a small wooden keepsake box that Thomas had built many years earlier. Inside were birthday cards I had written to the children that had been returned unopened after failed deliveries, photographs from family gatherings where I had been told everyone was too busy to celebrate, and little souvenirs I had purchased for my grandchildren during vacations they never knew I had taken with them in mind. Daniel looked through the box slowly, his hands trembling just enough for me to notice. He did not cry. He did not apologize. He simply whispered almost to himself, "I have been living inside someone else's version of our family." At that moment I understood that the truth had finally reached the one place where it mattered most, not because I forced it into the light, but because it had patiently uncovered itself piece by piece until there was nothing left to hide. Over the next several weeks, everything changed without a single dramatic confrontation. Daniel never told me every detail of the conversations he had with Vanessa, and I never asked him to. Some truths belong to the people who must face them. What mattered to me was not winning an argument. What mattered was watching my son slowly find his way back to himself. He began calling every Sunday again, just as he had years before. Sometimes we talked about ordinary things like the tomatoes growing in my garden or the weather forecast. Sometimes we said very little at all. Those quiet conversations meant more to me than any apology ever could, because they were no longer filtered through someone else's voice. A few weeks later, Daniel arrived with Emma and Lily for an afternoon visit. The girls ran through my front door as though no time had passed, laughing as they remembered where I kept the cookie jar above the refrigerator. Emma asked whether we could bake my apple pie together. Lily wanted to learn how to plant flowers in the backyard, because she remembered doing it with Grandpa when she was very young. Hearing Thomas mentioned so naturally filled my heart with both sadness and gratitude. Memories that had almost been erased were finding their way home. While the girls measured flour and argued about who would crack the eggs, Daniel quietly walked over to the living room bookshelf. He noticed the framed family photograph that had remained in the same place for years. "You never took it down," he said softly. I looked at the picture and smiled. Family is not something you remove from a shelf because life becomes complicated. He nodded without speaking. There was nothing else that needed to be said. Before leaving that evening, Daniel handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. He explained that some things deserve to be written instead of spoken, because written words cannot disappear as easily as misunderstood conversations. After they drove away, I sat in my favorite chair by the window and read every line slowly. He did not make excuses. He did not blame anyone else for the choices he had made. He accepted responsibility for allowing distance to grow between us, and thanked me for responding with patience instead of bitterness. At the very end, he wrote that trust could not be rebuilt in a single day, but he hoped they could rebuild it one honest conversation at a time. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the same wooden keepsake box Thomas had made so many years earlier. This time I was not storing another painful reminder. I was preserving the beginning of something new. As autumn arrived, our Sunday dinners quietly returned. There were no elaborate celebrations, no speeches, and no attempts to pretend the past had never happened. We simply chose to create better memories than the ones we had lost. Sometimes healing looks less like forgiveness spoken aloud and more like an extra chair being pulled up to the dinner table without anyone having to ask. Looking back now, I understand that lies can separate people for a surprisingly long time because they ask only to be believed. The truth asks for something much harder. It asks for patience, humility, and the courage to question what feels comfortable. I could never control the stories others chose to tell about me, but I could choose the way I lived each day. In the end, that quiet choice became stronger than every false word that had ever stood between a mother and her son. And every time I hear my grandchildren laughing in my kitchen once again, I am reminded that while deception may borrow time, it can never borrow the lasting strength of truth, because truth always finds its way home.